I am Ruth Usem, and it is absolutely a privilege and an honor for me to moderate the life and legacy of Hubert Humphrey with some very distinguished panelists here, people who really were part of Hubert Humphrey's life in a very integral way. It's a very especially poignant for me because I grew up on the north side of Minneapolis in the 40s when Hubert Humphrey was truly a household word. And in Mick's wonderful Art of the Possible, which I will reiterate what Kathy just said, is a must, not just for Minnesotans, but all citizens of the United States and the world. It really tells in a very real way the heart and the soul of the man who we celebrate today. In Mick's Art of the Possible, Bill Moyers, who plays a very big role in that wonderful documentary, says, "If you go and vote today, you owe something to Hubert Humphrey. If you drink fresh water, you owe something to Hubert Humphrey. If you breathe fresh air, you owe something to Hubert Humphrey." He believed that politics was our way together to achieve the best possibilities of democracy and not the worst. The art of the possible is what politics was all about. The state of Minnesota, I think, has a very proud history of producing some of the most important politicians in this country. And so I feel very fortunate. I think that Kathy has covered pretty well the accomplishments of this panel. So what I'd like to do now is just move to the questions. Some of the things that you heard about me earlier are true, but you don't know that I was also a school teacher. 3rd and 5th grades in the Minneapolis Public Schools, the Edina Public Schools. And so what I'd like to do is tell you what the questions are that I'm going to ask the panel. And then they will respond, and then we'll tell you what we told them. Okay. So, Hubert said, "You can always debate about what you should have done. The question is, what are you going to do?" And I think that's pretty much the theme of this panel today. Looking forward to 5 or 10 years, we want to anticipate the emerging challenges, just like he would have. Who would have thought that one person could make significant changes in the way that we live our lives, from anti-Semitism, which wasn't even talked about in a big way, to civil rights. He was the champion. He was the emblematic champion of issues that were off limits, but he did it. And then I'm going to ask you to offer your personal experiences and reflections about the policies and issues in your involvement with Hubert Humphrey. And so I want to ask, what shaped Hubert Humphrey's vision and commitment to ignored, forgotten, and many cases invisible people and problems? How would you describe his legacy in terms of policy and in terms of the process of bringing about political and legislative change? Not an insignificant issue today. What organizations and groups carry on Hubert Humphrey's legacy? Humphrey's words seem as relevant today as they were more than 60 years ago, and yet we haven't achieved the goals he so powerfully articulated. Why? Why hasn't that happened? What approaches and policies are needed to reach those goals? Everything from the environment to poverty to human rights. So we're just going to cover every subject that we all care about this morning. So let me begin with Skip. Skip, to bring it home a little bit, what was it like to be in the home of your family, that wonderful Muriel and wonderful Hubert? Trouble. Do you want the mic?
I suppose we better do that.
I think it's a good idea.
Ruth, thank you so much. I figured at some point I was going to get graded on something, and but to have Ruth be the person to grade, I'm in trouble already. So I thank you very much. You know, what was it like? So many people sometimes will ask me, say, well, you were in a very special family, and it must have been very different. I'll be honest with you, I don't think it was that different. We had friends, we grew up in, I went to Tuttle School, elementary school here in southeast Minneapolis. Then we moved off to Washington, and we were in the suburbs, excuse me. And I can remember when we first moved into that home in Chevy Chase. Is there water down here? Pardon my allergies. I told my wife 4 years ago, there are no such things as allergies. She was right and I was wrong. But we moved into a home that was literally on the edge of the burbs. When you think about now, the outer burbs are way out far. I can remember there was nothing out further than Chevy Chase, North Chevy Chase, where we were living, other than forest. That's all there was. So we were right there in the community, and went to public schools, and were engaged in all of the kind of public things and neighborhood things that went on in a normal life. And so there was no separation. We got in the same kind of trouble that kids normally get into. We had the same kind of fun, playing baseball, my mother demanding that I continue to play my cello, and those kinds of things. So, you know, growing up in this life was not that different. The difference was that Dad wasn't always there. He would come home late at night. We usually had Mom's vegetable beef soup when he was coming home, and for dinner. And if he was coming home early, that meant 7 o'clock. If it was kind of normal, it was 8 or 9 o'clock saying goodnight, and that was about it. But I never sensed, and I don't think my brothers and sister ever sensed, that he wasn't there. He was always there in a sense. I can tell you one other thing that I remember one time having a good conversation and an argument in Humphrey family was no problem at all. But I remember very distinctly one time feeling that my mother had not done the right thing and didn't have the right point of view on a particular matter, and Dad listened very carefully, and I gave him all of my arguments, and he said, well, that's very interesting. Now, do what your mother asks. That was the end of it. So I'll leave it at that, other than to say that I think it was a very normal family in that sense, and yet, on the other hand, it wasn't. Let me give you just one other example, and I was quite young at this time, but shows you the kind of difference and the wonderful opportunity I had. Two instances. Number one, my mother pulled me out of school one day, and we went down to the House of Representatives, and I was probably had to be about 8, 9 years old, and I sat on the steps of the gallery, and I watched General MacArthur give his final address. Now, how many people and how many kids had a chance to see that, where he said that old soldiers never die, they just fade away? And so that was rather unusual. The other experience that was very unusual was I can distinctly remember in 3rd grade getting called up by the school principal's office, and I thought, now what have I done wrong? This was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and we got to the principal's office, and I said, a car's going to pick you up. car picked me up, so now I thought, well, now what's going on with the family? Car picked me up. I went down to a baseball game with one of the Supreme Court justices and some other fancy dude that I can't remember. It was my father wanting to go to the baseball game, and he thought I ought to go with him. So, I mean, those are the kind of things that happened that made it a wonderful experience to grow up in this family.
I love that you bring the humanity of your dad to the subject, and I also know what a big role Muriel, your mom, played. And I have to tell you that one of my favorite, I don't know whether Hubert coined it or not, but I attribute it to him because that's where I heard it. He said, behind every successful man stands a surprised mother-in-law. Let's continue. Who would like to talk a little more about policy and humor and maybe Norm? Why not?
There you go. My talking about policy is absurd. I was not a policy man, but I grew up off of 6th Avenue North, as you mentioned. To end up working for Hubert Humphrey is a blessing beyond anybody. Oh, well, if I must. I'm going to tell the story of my hiring. My wife told me not to do it, but I'd like to tell you how I got hired by Humphrey. I had worked for Don Fraser, and Arvon and I still challenged one another on who ran the campaign in '62. I thought I did, she thought she did. But I went to Washington with Fraser, and one day I got a call from Bill Connell, who was Humphrey's chief assistant, who said, I'd like you to come over and work for us. I want you to handle Minnesota issues, but Humphrey likes to think he's involved at this level of hiring, and so you have to have an interview with him. They set it up for the next day. I went over. The appointment was at 10 o'clock. I went over a quarter to 10, and 10 o'clock came, 10:15 came, 10:30 came, 10:45 came, and I'm so arrogant that I got up, went to the front desk, and said, please tell Senator Humphrey I don't wait an hour for anybody. I am no longer interested in his job. And I went back to the Fraser office, feeling very good. And the phone rang, and it was Bill Connell, who said some vulgar things to me, and said that I set you up again for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You must go back. And I refused, but finally I gave in. The next day I went back, and 10 o'clock they ushered me into the Humphrey office, and I later discovered Humphrey had a dust compulsion. He didn't look up when I came in. He was standing up behind his desk, and he was dusting. Didn't look up. But this voice said, hi, Norman. I said, Senator, hello. And he looked up, finally, and he said, and this is a man who I almost never swore. He looked up and said, do you know that I have work coming out of my ass? I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, okay, you're hired.
Just like that?
I stood there like a fool, nothing, and he dusted. And finally, I just turned and headed for the door, and as I got to the door, he said, Norman? I said, yes, sir. He said, do you type? Well, I said, yes, I type. He said, good. Every time I hire a guy who thinks he needs a secretary, you've got to do your own typing. that was the beginning of my relationship with Hubert Humphrey. Subsequently, I overcame his doubts about me, mostly because I answered more letters than anybody else in the staff. He got in those days you got carbon copies, and I would do endless letters, and that established me so that ultimately when there was an opening for a press secretary, the only experience I had as a press secretary in press, I'd been a janitor at the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, and Humphrey hired me there. How much time should I take? Should I shut up? Well, I want to tell you another story that my wife thought it was dumb, but I like to do it. At the end of Humphrey's Washington career at the beginning, in 1969 in January, while he was still vice president but had lost the election, I got a call from somebody who said that Trygve had died and Humphrey was going to the funeral in Norway. I had always advanced Humphrey's trips overseas. In subsequent years, they send a group to each country. I went to all the countries. If he was going to do 10 countries in Europe, I advanced all 10 countries. If he were going to do 10 countries in Africa, I did all 10 countries. In any case, because of my experience, they asked if I would go to Oslo to advance the trip. But nobody told Humphrey. I went to Norway. Humphrey arrived, United States of America plane, with two other presidential appointees, Margaret Truman and Mrs. William Zeckendorf. I thought it would be funny if I dressed as a Norwegian, so I got me a big hat and a fur coat, and when the plane landed and taxied to a stop, I went up and walked in. Humphrey looked up and I said, "Velkommen til Midland," in my best Norwegian. And he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" Margaret Truman, of course, figured I was a Norwegian. And they were really just shocked at his impertinence. I'm going to tell two other stories, and then I'll sit down and shut up. During the Civil Rights battle for the Civil Rights Act in 1964, while Humphrey was still in the Senate, he said to the guy on our staff who handled civil rights, "I have not had a chance to talk to Martin Luther King personally and directly very much, I think at all, and I need to talk to him." So John Stewart, not the comedian, but our John Stewart, arranged for Martin Luther King to come in to see Humphrey. He came with Walter Fauntroy, who later served in Congress, and Andrew Young, who served all over the place. John Stewart was there, and I, for some bizarre reason, was the other staff person in the office there. So there were three of us. Humphrey laid out for Martin Luther King what he was going to do, compromises he would have to make, how he would butter up Southerners, what he would do. And I'm now well into my 80s, and I think back at that hour as the most precious hour of my life, as Hubert Humphrey described in detail what he was going to do to pass that bill. I could choke up with it. It is really a very special moment. And King, at the end of the hour, got up, and you could just see his eyes were fixed on the future and what Humphrey had just told him. I want to tell you one other thing. Soon after I went to work for Humphrey in the Senate, Humphrey was too cheap to get intercom. When every other senator in America had an intercom system so you could talk to someone, Humphrey had a buzzer system. This is the goddamnedest thing you ever saw. I mean, he had these buttons on his desk, and he would push a button and your desk would buzz, and I would always take off running through 6 or 7 offices into where he was. And one morning, my desk buzzed. And I raced up there, and Humphrey handed me a handwritten letter on, lined paper from a woman who said that her husband had been serving time in Leavenworth Penitentiary some years earlier, and she had written to Humphrey and asked him to get the guy switched from Leavenworth to Sandstone. Humphrey had done that. When he served his time and got out of Sandstone, she sent another scrawled, almost illiterate letter to Humphrey, saying that he was now an ex-con and had trouble finding work. Could Humphrey find work for him? You got to remember, this is a guy who can't vote, and they're not likely to tell anybody about Humphrey's doing it. Most senators put it aside, but Humphrey got him a job at a slaughterhouse out at Howard Lake. The letter that had come in there at that point was that the slaughterhouse had closed at Howard Lake, and the guy was now an unemployed ex-con, ex-knocker of the heads of cattle, and he needed work. Humphrey handed it to me and said, "You know everybody in Minnesota. Get him a job." I took the letter back to my desk, read it again, put it aside. About a week later, my desk buzzed again. And I raced up to Humphrey, and he said, I won't use the guy's name, he said, "Have you gotten so-and-so a job yet?" I said, "What?" I couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about. What? He said, "That letter I gave you last week." Oh, that letter. And so I called the Rolvog office, and I got the guy a test for a job as a truck driver in the highway department, and reported that to Humphrey with great, great glee and pride, and he patted me on the head and sent me on my way. The guy flunked the exam, and I went in just so full of myself, proud. I said to him, "Senator, he flunked the test." Humphrey said, "Get him another test." That was the essence of the man. There was never a limit on how much he could do for other people, whether they benefited him or not. I've got 2 or 3 more hours of stories, but I'll sit down.
Thank you, Norm. Skip. Tom and I were just talking and saying the legacy that Hubert left all of us was not only that he was the endless speaker, but in talking about him, nobody wants to stop. Tom Tipton? It's you.
Me?
It's you, man.
Yeah,
It's you, darling.
there you go.
I first need to thank Kathy Thunheim and Bob Meeks for this incredible week of love and dedication to the greatest human spirit of Minnesota and maybe across this nation and in many places across the world. I grew up in the nation's capital. When I was born, up until I was almost 30 years old, the nation's capital was segregated. I said the nation's capital, where the White House is, was segregated. Where this great American Hubert Humphrey had to try to change things for segregated. People didn't like people. What was fascinating about this man, I was president of the Young Democrats in Washington, D.C., and we were putting together the '68 campaign, and I wanted to be a part of it, so I volunteered. And at the Sheraton Park Hotel, he announced running for president. I was scared to death when he said, "Well, Tom Tipton, we're going to have a great campaign, etc." What made me nervous was the fact that Hubert never saw color. I'm not sure he knew what color he was. But there was no color. He loved people. He walked out on as you mentioned, Al, in 1948, Strom Thurmond walked out on him, right? I'm surrounded by people who know far more than I do. walked out on him, and the whole Southern delegation walked out, but he stuck to his principles. From that South Dakota drugstore, he knew when the storms was raging all kinds of heck, he still stuck. When he went to Louisiana, that's one of the first times he saw black people in misery, in suffering, in pain. That's why I wanted to be a part of whoever this man was, Mr. Humphrey. When we talk about Hubert Humphrey, we have to remember who Leon Sullivan was. It was Hubert Humphrey who gave Leon Sullivan the first $75,000 to start the OIC programs in Minnesota, in Philadelphia, from a jailhouse. Am I right? Correct me if I'm wrong. It was Hubert Humphrey, as my brother Norm Sherman said, who stood up for what had to be done to correct some of the ills. And it was up until 1952 that the nation's capital, where I lived, where I grew up, with Walter Fauntroy, who was my classmate at Dunbar High School, was still segregated. And my mother, who happened to be the first woman of color to be a radio announcer in America, met Hubert Humphrey and was touched by his magic. Oh, I could tell stories, but I feel from my heart, as I said to my sister here, who he was and what he represented for all the people. Just before the second campaign in 1972, I had an advertising agency, and 1 o'clock in the morning we took Mr. Humphrey back to the suite with Jack Chestnut, and I said goodnight to him and went to my room. And the phone rang. It was Mr. Humphrey. He said, "Tom, I want to see you." I said, "Oh, what did I do? I must have did something wrong." And he called me back to his room and said, "Tom, sit down." I said, "Oh, I'm fired." And he said, "Tom, I hear that you're having problems with your advertising agency, that you should be back there running it. What can I do for you?" And I looked at him and I said, "I will tell you what you can do for me. You can be president for all the people. That's all I want. That's one of your legacies. That's what I feel. That's why I'm here." He said, "Yes, I understand that, Tom, but you see, this I'll never forget." He said, "You know, I do things for people I don't like. Why can't I do something for you?" I said, No. You don't understand. I said, I want you to be president for all the people. That's why his sons and his grandsons and granddaughters are who they are and what they are and what makes them who they are today. Give them a hand. Before Dr. King, there was Hubert Humphrey. The nation's capital is segregated. I stand to be corrected. No one can tell me that LBJ loved Hubert Humphrey. I'm sorry. I just got to say that. But he tried, because we know that in 1972, that if he had spoke out on the Vietnam War 3 weeks before the convention, he would have been president of the United States. Am I right? Norm, correct me. Hubert Humphrey does excite me. He excites me because I remember, as I mentioned yesterday, that when he got up to speak at Metropolitan Baptist Church, which you know where it is, and he was getting ready to speak, I'll never forget this, and the pastor said to me, "Listen, Tom, why don't you sing a song before Hubert comes to speak?" I said, "Okay, I'll do that." So I got up and I sang, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And when I finished, Hubert looked at me and said, "Tom, I didn't know you sang." I said, "Well, you never asked." This friend to America, Black America, was changed because of Hubert Humphrey. The nation's capital became desegregated because of Hubert Humphrey. I worked for Dr. King. I helped put together the March on Washington in 1963. You see, we thought that there would be problems, that there would be police and people going crazy at that March on Washington. But guess what? there was no problem. We were there for a purpose, to hear this man, based on what Hubert Humphrey had done for him, set him up to move this nation, move people to a better way of life in their thinking. And then in 1978, we lost a great American. And that grabs me. I remember taking Jim Marshall and Alan Page and Carl Eller out to the home to see him before he passed away. And I remember that Monday morning we were there with him, and Jim was crying, and these big, great purple people eaters were crying like babies. And he had a Dallas Texas shirt on one side. You had given it to him, Skip, and the Vikings on the other side. He put the Vikings on and said, this is who's going to win. And he was not in good shape. With my last 2 minutes, I simply want to add that we can't talk about the Humphreys until we talk about this family, and Muriel, and Muriel, and Muriel. Because it was Muriel, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, who in Louisiana looked around and saw the slums and said, what is this? They'd never seen that many black people, none in South Dakota, very few here in Minnesota. But he saw it, and he made up his mind then that this would change. And in closing, when I was honored to sing at his funeral, I remember I was at the International in 14th and Thomas Circle. And Skip will remember this. The phone rang when I walked in the door. I turned on the TV, but I already knew we'd lost a great American. The first person I spoke to was Bruce. And then I spoke to you. And before you said him, I said, I know. And you know, I've got some problems with my memory, but I don't forget this. You said, well, my daddy always wanted you to sing at his funeral, and I gulped. And Bruce got back to the phone and said, well, just sing what you want to sing. And I chose, he'll understand and say, well done. If when you give the best of your service, telling the world that the Savior has come, be not dismayed when sometimes friend won't believe you, because he'll understand and say, well done. And so the walls across this nation, in schools, places, North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, slums, were corrected, because this great American, that statue outside kind of says it all, gave his all. He didn't care. He was going to make this change come heck or high water. Come hell, okay. And he did it with love. He did it with compassion. And he did it with a lot of fragrance in all that he did for him, for his family, and for this nation. And that's why today, as we stand here and share these incredible memories, yes, we could talk all day. This is my last 30 seconds. I thank God for this man in the lives of all of us, in my life and in the lives of Black America, whose lives were changed, colleges were changed, universities were changed because of him. Thank God for you, Hubert. God bless America.
I want to thank you first for putting me after Tom Tipton. That was yikes. Anyway, I'd like to thank Bob Meek, first of all, for putting this on. I'd like to give him a hand for this. And everyone, Kathy and all the other people involved, thank you very much. And over the course of this film that we did 52 interviews in 10 cities with all kinds of Humphrey people, many who have all, since we started, are gone now. And I wanted to thank Bob Voller down here in front, who worked with me on every single interview, shot all the interviews, so I want to thank him. And a hand for him, too. Over all of these interviews, we heard dozens and dozens of Humphrey stories, as you can imagine, half of which were in Norman's interview. But we heard lots of Humphrey stories. So I'd like to tell a couple because I have a platform, a couple short ones. One is about the speaking. He was speaking one time and he was going on and on in this fashion. And he said to the small crowd, he said, "Does anyone have a watch?" You want to know what time it was? And someone yelled out, "Humphrey, you don't need a watch, you need a calendar." So that was one of my favorite short ones. But then the other one, not too far from here at Minneapolis City Hall, the Minneapolis Club. Humphrey was mayor. It was probably 1943 or 4. And he went to the Minneapolis Club for lunch. Minneapolis Club was a conservative, all-white, all-male bastion at that time. And in walks liberal Mayor Humphrey. Sits down for lunch and someone yells out across the room, "Humphrey, you couldn't get a single vote in here. What are you doing in here?" And Humphrey stood up and said, "I'll bet you $10 I could win an election in here." And he took the bet, and Humphrey got up and walked into the kitchen and brought out the African-American staff, which outnumbered everybody in the place, and won the bet. One of my favorite stories. Yesterday I had the honor of appearing with Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius in Washington at the Humphrey Building. We gave an event it was another celebration for Humphrey's birthday, and to speak to their employees. And there's a couple things I just wanted to say that I said yesterday about him, and also she was eloquent, and you can find that on a webcast at HHS at some point, because she was wonderful. And of course her father, John Gilligan, was governor of Ohio, was a friend of Hubert's. So this is a couple things I said that I wanted to repeat. Humphrey believed deeply that our government had an inherent responsibility to provide people with the tools they needed to reach their individual potential, and that's what drove him. The motto at HHS is improving the health, safety, and well-being of America. And it sounds pretty much like the same mission to me. So I told them, in fact, you're continuing the work of Hubert Humphrey. And I can't think of a more appropriate person for which to name that building. Now, in a different time in our politics, something interesting happened, because Humphrey was at the dedication of that building on November 1st, 1977. At that time, it was HEW. It was the first time that a federal building was named after a living person. It was only a couple months before he died, of course, but it was a different time in our politics because the resolution to name that building was forwarded by a Republican, Bob Dole, who really paraded it around the Senate to get it done. And to forward the resolution, name the Humphrey building, name the HEW building at the time, the Humphrey building. So Dole said of Humphrey, and I love this quote, he said, and it sort of really describes his legacy. His consuming passion has been to make America a little better, make the world a little better, to make life itself a little better. In reaching out for those goals, he overshot his nation's highest honor and became instead one of the world's great leaders, one of the major moral forces in our time or in any time. I just love that quote. While Humphrey helped to create many international programs like the Peace Corps and Food for Peace and so many other things that you will see if you ever see the film. It's an amazing record. But many of the programs that HHS deal with and dealt with were either created or improved domestic programs by Humphrey. So the employees there really understand who he was, and that was part of the celebration to let them know that they're carrying on the work. But he had all these legislative successes. It was amazing, and many of the programs they deal with, as I said, were Humphrey ideas. And I told him that the legislative process was to him simply a vehicle, as Bill Moyers said, to spread the word of America. And his work provides his work and his belief in the preamble, which is also in the film at the end, his understanding of the preamble as a description of an active government provides a direct and contemporary connection between the original ideals of our democracy and the wonderful work that's done at HHS. So those are my words to them, and I thank you.
Thank you. You've already heard from me, but Ruth insists that I say a few words. First thing I would say is the first thing you want to do as a speaker, never follow Tom Tipton. Okay? I want to just say a couple of things that I want to follow up on something that Tom said. But first of all, I'll tell you, I grew up in southern Minnesota, on a farm in southern Minnesota, and I'd never seen a black person. But my mother was born in South Carolina and grew up in Tennessee. And when I was about 9, we went to visit her relatives in Newport, Tennessee. And all the way down, we drove down, she talked about this colored woman who was her nanny, and we were going to meet her. And so we got there, and we met her, and I was disappointed because she wasn't colored, she was just brown. So that's the kind of educating you had to do with people who grew up here, young people. Tom, you mentioned something I didn't say in my previous remarks. I want to say, Again, I apologize for quoting my favorite author, but in the closing chapter of my book, I said, indeed, Minnesota's and to a great degree America's modern political history really began with Humphrey's electrifying civil rights speech at the 1948 Democratic National Convention, when he urged his party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and work forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. Humphrey's speech helped Harry Truman achieve one of the greatest upsets in American political history and launched Humphrey on a path that took him from this city hall to the U.S. Senate, to the vice presidency, and almost to the White House 20 years later before he returned to the Senate in 1971. I also want to say a couple of things about Norman Sherman, who he and I share the experience of being vice presidential press secretaries, where you have to be very careful what you say, not to offend the number one person, and we both been guilty of it. One of the great moments in vice presidential press history was when Norman Sherman was asked something about Lyndon Johnson, and he said, "Lyndon who?" Anyway, thank you all for your attention. It's great to be here. We can share stories all. Thank you.
Well, it's been a privilege for me, once again, to moderate this panel of distinguished people, wonderful people, human people, the kind of people that Hubert Humphrey exemplified. And I think that we covered pretty much the legacy and the what I'm going to call the heartbeat of Hubert Humphrey. He had his hands on just about every politician that has come out of Minnesota and maybe the nation as well. I got involved in politics because I am firmly in line with civil rights and how much it means to what we are all about. Hubert Humphrey exemplified the values that I think Minnesota is. And I think his everlasting legacy is one person can make a difference, and he was the difference for a whole lot of us. And the challenge, I think, that remains is, what do we do now? What do we do as citizens of this city, of this state, of this nation? We got amendments coming up, my friends. What are we going to do? Let's look to the conscience of the man that probably more than anyone left us this legacy. And I want to thank you all for listening, for being here, and especially to my panel. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Bob Meek, very much.